This is College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College.
Everybody thinks that they know a lot about Shakespeare, and sometimes even people dispute whether Shakespeare was a real person or not. But the fact of the matter is that many aspects of Shakespeare and his times that we know very little about it. And to explore those areas, we invited today Dr. Laura Kolb to talk about those aspects that most people are unaware about Shakespeare and his time. Dr. Kolb was a native, or is a native from South Bend, Indiana. She got her bachelor's degree in Columbia University after growing up in Virginia, and her master's in humanities and doctorate in English from the University of Chicago, very windy city. And today she's an assistant professor in the Department of English at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences, Baruch College, City University of New York. Welcome to College Talk, Dr. Kolb.
Thank you.
So my first question to you is, why did you choose to study English literature?
So I didn't really choose. Ever since I was very small, my parents read to me, and I loved to read. And when I got to college, and there's so many options for what you can study, I thought, I'll do theater, or I'll do this, or I'll do that. But I kept taking English classes. And about halfway through, I realized this is what I'm majoring in. This is probably what I want to do.
So you think English was in your DNA?
Well, it was certainly in my upbringing. I'm not sure about my DNA because who knows? But it was there from an early age.
Okay. Talking about early, officially you appear as a specialist on early English. And we need to define exactly what you mean in terms of the time scale, because it's not antiquity, it's not that far away in terms of history.
So the period I work on in England runs roughly from 1550 to 1650, 1660, and those are the dates that I work on. There are debates about where the period itself begins and ends. And generally, in the field, this gets designated early modern English. The language that is spoken and written is recognizably modern English. The grammar, the syntax, most of the vocabulary. It's the language we have today, as opposed to Middle English, which is actually a different language, or Old English, which is such a different language. When we look at it, we need a translation unless we've studied it.
Yeah. Okay. So, and that is a period that is known also as the Renaissance, which is interesting because most people connect Renaissance with Italy, particularly Florence, and in an earlier time, late 15th century and 16th century. So tell us why you can say that there was an English Renaissance later on.
So England is an island, and things sometimes come later to islands. So the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical learning, and at the same time, the celebration of the possibilities of the vernacular language of English, or in Italy, of Italian, that happens a little later in England. And in many cases, the English are following Italian models and French models. But we really do get a Renaissance. We get a flowering of especially literature. You get, the writing of Spenser's epic poem, The Faerie Queene. You get this sort of flourishing of theatrical productions, and of lyric poetry as well. And so really this period in the late 16th century and early 17th century is a very special moment in the history of literature, and especially English literature.
Do you think that when we talk about the Renaissance, people just refer because of Shakespeare, or were there other authors that they were involved in that Renaissance?
Very much there were other authors. So for instance, Edmund Spenser, sitting down to write an epic poem, very self-consciously is modeling himself on Virgil, the Roman author. So he's reviving and also Englishing, rendering into English, this Roman tradition, this classical tradition. And he's also looking at Italian models, so he's looking at Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, he's looking at Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata, and in many ways he's like doing this gathering and synthesizing and creating something new that is what we think of as Renaissance literary production, that it is taking something old and making it new again. And many authors do this, so Spenser, Shakespeare, but many others as well.
But I don't think, despite all that, that the fact that Shakespeare sounds so contemporary in many ways, despite the fact that although it's modern English, people don't write or speak like that anymore, why do you think Shakespeare still resonates with all of us after more than 4 centuries?
So I think about this all the time because I teach Shakespeare, and my students are sometimes astonished at how especially certain moments will speak to them. And I have a couple of, I have a couple of thoughts about this. And one is that one of Shakespeare's very, very basic insights is that in social life, we are always acting. I am acting here right now. When I am in front of the class, I am, of course, performing. I have a persona that I don't necessarily have in my home, that I don't necessarily have when I'm riding the subway. That's a slightly different face that I present. And Shakespeare loves that fact. So I like to start the year teaching Richard II. And Richard II begins with high ceremonial speech. It's a public moment, and the king there's been a dispute, and he's arbitrating it. And then a couple scenes later, you get a private scene, and the king, who has spoken this incredible ceremonial poetry, it's performative speech, it makes reality happen. He just gets sarcastic and snarky because he's in private. And my students, and I think people in general, really respond to that representation of humanity as something that isn't stable, that is situationally created, that is serial, and that is constantly a little bit theatrical.
I also think that some of the things that Shakespeare wrote are messages that not only are true today, but also immediately makes a connection with reality. For example, in Hamlet's soliloquy, and the insolence of office. Well, we know how insolent government can be, basically. Or the lost delay. We know any legal thing takes months for something to happen. And to me, it's amazing how he was able to identify themes that still we can have a resonance with us today. Do you think that also that's part of the reason why Shakespeare sounds so contemporary today?
I do. I think that's right. And he's very attuned to the way power works. And even though he lived in a society whose hierarchies worked slightly, looked different from ours, he lived in a monarchy, and a lot of the time he's writing about kingship. Still, those lessons about how power works, how people exist in relation to power, those resonate. And then on the more intimate level, the interactions between people, between, say, Othello and Desdemona, or Hamlet and Ophelia, those little back and forths, those are recognizable as well.
Okay. The other thing I found interesting is the fact that when we talk about that Renaissance, people refer mostly in the context of Elizabeth I. But the matter of fact is she was succeeded by James I, and that's why it's called Jacobean period. To what extent do you think that the change in the head of state, which actually wasn't kind of the son or daughter of Elizabeth, created a different context for writers to say, no, we need to talk about different themes. So there's something different going on here.
And so writers in the period were constantly addressing, sometimes in veiled ways and sometimes in more explicit ways, first, anxieties about succession, and second, after the succession, both a celebration of James's rule and then a little later, anxieties about it. So there's a wonderful reading of Shakespeare's play The Tempest that Professor David Caston at Yale wrote this piece about The Tempest, which says, yes, this is about an island in a remote place, and we can read it as about colonial expansion, but it is also about King James, and it is because at the heart of that play is a daughter who's been married off dynastically, and the play was probably performed to celebrate the marriage of James's daughter. So plays could be used like that to sort of praise and celebrate the king, but then a little later, you get something like Shakespeare and Middleton's, it was a collaborative play, Timon of Athens, which is a warning about going too much into debt. And it's written in a moment when the king is borrowing very, very heavily. And it's clearly in a very veiled way. It is addressing the king's behaviors.
Okay. Now, going back to something we mentioned earlier about Shakespeare identity. Some of our listeners may be thinking, well, but I have heard that Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare. He was actually having someone else writing all this stuff. What is your take on that? And why so much fuss about this particular thing that most people have said this is nonsense?
I mean, people love a conspiracy. And I think that's sort of, and also I think, so speaking first to the why are people invested in this idea, I do think that there's some class prejudice involved. Shakespeare was not a nobleman, and he didn't go to college. He went to grammar school. Now, grammar school, in the period, you learned Latin, you learned Greek, you translated Ovid, you translated your translations back into Latin. It was rigorous. It certainly gave you enough of a literary education to write stories, to write plays. But all of the other candidates who get floated are generally of higher birth and greater degree of education. So that's part of it. I also do think people love a conspiracy. Like, that's also part of it. There's too much evidence from the period that William Shakespeare, we have records of his birth and death, we have his will, and we have records that he wrote plays. We also have, wonderfully, he had enemies, and his enemies wrote about him. They didn't, he was seen as he was called an upstart crow who thought of himself as the only Shakespeare in the country. So this older guard of playwrights didn't like this young guy, and that seems to me sort of irrefutable evidence. Who would make that up?
And the other thing, I mean, he in a way, he was unique because he actually retired out of his revenue as a writer, something that we think retirement is something relatively new in history, but actually he did it.
I mean, being a theater professional was relatively new in history. So, but I tell my students, the arts, they help with upward mobility too. Look at Shakespeare. But he was writing in a moment when the sons of bricklayers and glove makers and grocers could suddenly dedicate themselves to writing. And that's a very historically specific moment when you can actually not pursue the trade that your father pursued. And so his sort of making it and getting a coat of arms and retiring, that's this narrative of success, which actually is, that's also familiar to us.
Yeah, absolutely. The other area in which you have done some work, some research about the role play by women in theater. And I don't think most people know this, but at that time, women really didn't act on the stage.
They did not.
And when I say that, sometimes people say, oh, so Romeo and Juliet were a couple of guys. And the answer is yes.
Yes, yes.
So why do you think that there was this bias against women playing the role of women?
So being on stage and being looked at was understood in some way as fundamentally a sexualized relationship. And so actors were actually often compared, even male actors were just, one of the things that shows up in anti-theatrical writing of the period is that they are somehow like prostitutes, that they are selling themselves, that they are not self-same, right? They are being other than themselves. And that was seen as feminizing, as sexualized. Like there was a lot of anxiety around the theater. So that has something to do with why the actors were all male in England, which was not true everywhere in Europe. The other thing is, though, playwrights played with this. They exploited this. Shakespeare loves to have his heroines, who are boys, dressed as women. He loves to have them say, I'm going to put on a costume. I'm going to be a boy. So suddenly you have in Twelfth Night or in As You Like It, a boy dressed as a girl, dressed as a boy. And that sort of vibration of, well, she's both, he's both, and there's this other layer. That's incredibly sexy, that bothness. And he plays with that. He has so much fun with that.
Okay. Also, I think it's interesting that a lot of people don't know this, but theater was a big thing in England. I mean,
it was.
And not only because at that time, of course, there wasn't television or anything like that. That was the only real entertainment for people.
Well, there were other entertainments that were public. Sermons were actually, they were beautifully written. Delivery really mattered, and they were an event. They and actually preachers were worried that the theater was competition, and that playing on Sunday would draw people away from the sermon.
Yeah.
And entertainments like bear baiting, watching a bear be attacked by dogs, that persisted. But theater was enormous, and there was this flourishing of these big theaters that if you think of it in terms of New York, you'd have to, like, if we had 10 Barclays Centers and everybody went all the time and filled the seats.
Yeah.
London was much smaller than New York is now, but sort of percentage-wise, that's what it would look like.
The other thing, for anyone who has been in England, you realize very soon that this is a very class society. I mean, even today, it doesn't matter, and you see the reflected in the accent that people have and all that sort of things. But what I found fascinating about theater at that time is that people from many different classes attended the same play the same day. And I think that is kind of counterintuitive regarding the notion that we have of class in England.
It's true. The theaters were stratified by price, so where the entrance fee you were able to pay determined a little bit where you sat. But the fact remains, there was an enormous mingling of classes and also genders. Women went to the theater. That's true. And on stage as well as off, one of the critiques of the theater was that you saw kings mingling with clowns, that you saw, the upper class characters who belong in a tragedy on stage with the lower class characters who belong in a comedy, and that the theater was somehow challenging literary categories but also social categories, and it did that on stage and in the audience as well.
Okay. An area that you have spent considerable time working on is regarding the economics and how that is reflected in theater.
Right.
Why do you think that was such an important part of the plays being written at that time?
So I think there's a very simple answer, which is that economic life for most people was a little bit theatrical. This is a moment when everyone is buying and selling on credit. There's a perennial shortage of cash in Shakespeare's England. So if you knew someone and you had to buy something from that person, you'd probably use credit because you're saving your cash for when you need to transact with a stranger or you need to pay a tithe. What this means, and also this is a moment before centralized banking and before credit limits, credit checks. So all people have to go on is trust. And trust builds up over time, but it's also a little bit based on appearances. If you show up in my shop and you want to borrow cloth to make a suit, and you look like a wealthy young gentleman, and you speak well, and you are kind to my shop assistants, I am much more likely to sell you on credit, to write down your name in my account book. Mm-hmm. And in this period, there are actual handbooks telling you how to cultivate credit. Using the right words, the right gestures, by building up a reputation, either in the country or in the city, and the credit works differently in those two settings. Yeah. And playwrights love this because, of course, what people are doing in their economic lives is acting.
Yeah, acting.
So they build plots around this phenomenon, and you'll get, even on a very small scale, you'll have one character tell another, oh, if you want to get rich in the city, don't bother trying to make money. Wear the right clothes and pretend you have wealthy friends. Yeah. And that's how you build credit.
One of your papers, at least one of your papers, deals with something I found very interesting. It's about Othello, which is one of the most famous of the Shakespeare's plays. But when you think about Othello, you basically think about racism and jealousy and acceptance and what else? Repentance, revenge, betrayal, all that sort of things. But yet your paper talks about mathematical Othello. Explain that for us, because to me there were like two things that couldn't combine.
So Othello, first of all, it's set in Venice, which is a commercial city. The reason that Othello is in Venice is because Venice is a space of buying and selling and borrowing and lending, and spaces like that draw together people from different places. Mm-hmm. And Venice is also the first place where anyone sat down and wrote a math textbook in the vernacular, so not in Latin. Mm. so I look at the way the play uses the language of reckoning, the language of counting up, and especially Iago uses this language in order to. So I do this in order to look at a kind of register, a thread that hasn't been pulled before with Othello, and it is this thread of evaluating people. So Iago is constantly evaluating things, right? He knows how much money is worth. Yeah. He talks about how reputation is a jewel. He speaks of one of his friends as though he is trash. And those value terms mean something very specific to Iago. And one of the things he teaches Othello to do is to start evaluating people as though they are objects, as though they have a certain kind of worth that derives from circulation, not from kind of innate qualities. And once he introduces that idea of the way value comes through exchange, comes through being public, that is the moment that Othello starts to see the world differently than he has, and see Desdemona differently than he has.
You think that Shakespeare was not clear about where Othello was really coming from for any particular reason? Because he's described as a Moor, but that's about it that we know about his background.
Well, he says
and he was a soldier.
He was a soldier, and I mean, he the problem is Othello tells us about Othello's background, and Othello romanticizes himself. But I mean, he says he's been a soldier since he was 7 years old. And he describes adventures, captivity, strange sights that he's seen. So he's seen men whose heads grow beneath their shoulders. I mean, so some of what he says is undoubtedly, true. I mean, he's a character made of words, so none of it is true. And some of it is fanciful in order to impress his audience. But we know he's from North Africa. That would not have been... So Shakespeare almost certainly never went to Venice, but there were published accounts in English of what Venice is like, and there are lists of where people are from, and they always include, Turkey, North Africa, but also Othello has a source story, a little Italian short story by an author called Cintio, and in that, Othello doesn't have a name. He's just referred to as the Moor. The Moor, yeah. So it's there in the source as well.
And it's interesting because this is not the only play in which Shakespeare used a Moor. You have in the Merchant of Venice. And
you have Morocco, the Prince of Morocco, and in Titus Andronicus.
Exactly.
The villain, Aaron the Moor. And actually, that's a really interesting thing to track, is the way in Titus Andronicus, there is, in some sense, Shakespeare writes this sort of tight fit between what he would think of as exterior and interior. And Aaron at one point says, I'm going to be a villain. I will have my soul as black as my face. Yeah. By the time he's writing Merchant and Othello, he's much more interested, not just in the split between inner and outer, but actually in the way race is socially constructed. Yeah. And he's really interested in how racism works by those plays. Yeah. I love teaching those plays because they are so smart on the social construction of otherness. Yeah. Especially Othello. Morocco is treated kind of badly in Merchant. Not that Othello isn't treated badly in Othello. Yeah.
And the thing is, I mean, Shakespeare in many ways, I think part of his charm in his work is a lot of his plays are based in places that most people may have heard the name but have no idea what they look like. Right. Even The Tempest, which is basically what happened in Bermuda, right, and all that sort of things. And do you agree that the people felt fascinated about learning about these strange lands through a theatrical play?
So I think that's definitely part of the appeal, but often, I mean, so in The Winter's Tale, there's a famous scene that takes place on the seacoast of Bohemia. Bohemia has no seacoast. So, or As You Like It takes place in the forest of Arden, which when I ask my students, what country is this play in? My favorite response is France, with a question mark at the end, because yes, it is, but not really. Yeah. His settings tend to be places where the extraordinary can happen, far more than they are really France or really Bohemia or really Bermuda.
I know this may sound controversial, but when I think about this particular topic, it comes to my mind the James Bond novels, because he's always going to these exotic places. Yeah. So I don't know if it's kind of a British tradition in making things interesting by placing these individuals in far away places.
I mean, that's certainly part of it, and there are plays. There are many romances, so plays about voyaging and ships and shipwrecks that aren't by Shakespeare. But then also in the period, you get an intense focus on London. So Shakespeare really doesn't do this, but Thomas Heywood, Thomas Middleton, his contemporaries, they love to set plays in London and to name the particular streets. Yeah. And there's a pleasure for the London audience of being in the know of, on that street, that's where you can buy, that's where you buy cloth, or that's where you buy fish.
Yes.
And this kind of interaction will happen there.
Okay. Well, this was a very interesting conversation. I had more questions, but we ran out of time, unfortunately, which means that I think this was very entertaining. So thank you for coming to this show. And next week, we're going to have here Dr. Deborah Kaplan, who works in the Fine and Performing Arts Department, who will be talking about the charm of the Jewish theater. So we'll continue on the theater tradition in this show. So stay tuned.
This has been College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a production of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College. All rights reserved, 2017.